Hey everybody, welcome to our deep dive. Today we're tackling some fascinating ideas about Puerto Rican identity.
And some pretty sharp societal critiques, too.
We'll be looking closely at the work of two prominent essayists,
Carmen Barcy.
and Magali Garcia Ramos.
Their writing is so insightful.
They really delve into the complexities of Puerto Rican culture and society,
Definitely. We're going to be talking about things like the struggle to maintain cultural identity.
especially in the face of globalization,
Yeah. And the impact of immigration.
the emotional toll it takes on those who leave and those who stay behind. That's something a lot of people can relate to, I think.
For sure. And we'll also be looking at the clash between moral values and just the pressures of daily life.
Especially in a society grappling with economic inequality.
Right. And of course, we can't forget about the pervasive issue of sexism. It's woven throughout their work.
So are you ready to jump into these thought-provoking essays?
Absolutely. I'm excited to dive in.
Okay, let's start with Carmen Barcy's Año Bisiesto.
Oh, this one is brilliant. His writing style is so sharp, so satirical.
It's like he's holding up a mirror to Puerto Rican society, but it's a funhouse mirror.
Yeah, you're laughing, but you're also recognizing some uncomfortable truths.
Exactly. And he uses this amazing metaphor in Año Bisiesto.
Comparing modern Puerto Rico to the Cyclops Polyphemus from Homer's Odyssey,
Wait, the one-eyed giant.
that's one.
But what does a giant have to do with Puerto Rico?
Well, think about what happens to Polyphemus.
He gets blinded by Odysseus.
Right. And after he loses his sight, he also loses his sense of self.
Ah, I see where you're going with this. His identity is shattered.
Exactly. And Barcy is arguing that Puerto Rico is in danger of doing the same thing. He sees this obsession with superficial trends, this turning away from cultural roots, as a real threat.
It's like he's saying, if you don't know where you came from, how can you know where you're going?
Precisely.
Oh.
And he's also critiquing this creeping mediocrity he observes, this acceptance of things just being good enough.
And he does it all with humor, like those anecdotes about Carlo.
Who doesn't even know where Italy is on a map?
I know. It's hilarious, but also kind of disturbing.
Right. And then there's Chevres, who keeps changing his name to dodge responsibility.
It's like they're caricatures, but they also represent these very real trends that Barcy is worried about.
He's using humor to make us pay attention to these serious issues.
And it's not just about forgetting the past, it's about this erosion of quality, this acceptance of mediocrity that he sees as a real danger.
Absolutely. And he even takes aim at the decline of proper Spanish in Puerto Rico.
Oh yeah, he goes into detail about all the misspelled signs and the grammatical errors that have become so common.
Like misspelling Caño Martín Peña on official signs. You know, that name is synonymous with Puerto Rican identity.
It's like he's saying that even language, something so fundamental to culture, is starting to erode.
It's a powerful symbol of this larger cultural shift he's observing.
It makes you think, have you ever noticed that kind of decline in language or cultural awareness where you live?
It's definitely something to pay attention to. It can happen so gradually that you don't even realize it until it's gone too far.
So Barcy is not just being a grammar stickler. He's making a deeper point about the importance of language as a cornerstone of culture.
Exactly. And he's suggesting that when you let language erode, you're chipping away at your identity. And he explores these themes even further in another essay, La crianza, con la boca es un mami.
Which means raising kids, it's easy to talk.
Yeah, he's diving into the challenges of raising children with strong values in a world that's constantly throwing conflicting messages at them.
Especially in a place like Puerto Rico, where traditional values often clash with the realities of globalization and economic pressures.
It's a tough balancing act, and Barcy introduces us to this family that's trying to navigate those very tensions. The father figure is particularly interesting.
He's critical of the system, but then his actions sometimes contradict his ideals. Like he's saying one thing but doing another.
It's that classic do as I say, not as I do dilemma that so many parents struggle with. We want to instill certain values in our kids, but we're also part of the system we're criticizing.
And the kids aren't buying it either. Barcy uses some really poignant anecdotes to show this, like Cagwalks, the son, getting bullied at school.
Or Tanya, the daughter, criticizing capitalism while wearing American brands. They're holding a mirror up to their father's hypocrisy.
It highlights those contradictions we all grapple with, especially as we try to figure out our own values in a world that often sends such mixed messages.
And Barzi uses those everyday moments, those family interactions, to expose the larger forces at play. He's showing how capitalism and colonialism have seeped into the fabric of Puerto Rican society.
It's like they're not just personal choices anymore. They're influenced by these larger systems and ideologies.
Exactly. He's making us think about how those forces shape our identities, our values, even our everyday choices.
So how do you navigate those influences, both in your own life and when you think about raising kids? It's a constant balancing act, right?
It really is. Now, let's shift gears a bit and talk about Magali Garcia Ramos and her incredibly powerful essay, Los cerebros que se van y el corazón que se queda.
The brains that leave and the heart that stays. Wow, that title is so evocative.
It perfectly captures the emotional roller coaster of immigration, and it's something that resonates deeply in Puerto Rico with this concept of the brain drain.
Where skilled professionals often feel like they have to leave the island to find better opportunities.
Right. So you have these two groups, the cerebros, the brains who leave seeking a brighter future.
The corazones, the hearts who stay behind, holding on to the traditions and the essence of the island.
It's like this bittersweet reality playing out on both sides. The ones who leave often carry this heavy weight of nostalgia, this idealization of the island they left behind.
Like they're chasing a dream, but they're also running away from something they can never truly escape.
And then you have those who stay. They might face even greater challenges, but they do so with this incredible resilience. They're the keepers of the flame, the ones who hold on to the traditions and the spirit of the community.
It's like they're the anchor, keeping the island grounded even as the world around them is changing.
Exactly. And Garcia Ramos uses these contrasting concepts of Allah, meaning over there, and acá, meaning here.
Representing the promise of a new life, and acá symbolizing the warmth and familiarity of home.
It's that constant tension between the pull of the unknown and the comfort of the familiar.
Have you ever felt that pull of Allah, that excitement, that maybe even scary unknown future you were drawn to?
Oh, absolutely. It's a feeling I think many of us can relate to.
It makes you wonder, what does home really mean in a world where people are increasingly mobile and connected across borders?
It's a question that resonates on so many levels. And Garcia Ramos doesn't offer any easy answers. She simply presents the raw, emotional reality of both decisions, leaving us to ponder the consequences. Now let's dive into another one of her essays that really gets you thinking. Hostos, brother, esto está difícil.
Which translates to, Hostos, brother, this is tough. Just the title alone tells you it's going to be a challenging read.
It drops us right into this moral dilemma, set against the backdrop of economic hardship in Puerto Rico. The story revolves around a student from a low-income background
who gets caught in a difficult situation after a car accident.
He's given this opportunity to use stolen car parts to fix his car, which would solve a huge financial burden for him. But of course, it's not that simple.
His conscience is telling him one thing, but his circumstances are pushing him in another direction.
And the title itself is so significant here. It references Eugenio Maria de Hostos, a prominent Puerto Rican intellectual and moral figure.
By invoking his name, it's like Garcia Ramos is setting up this clash between ideals and reality.
Like, how do you live up to those lofty moral principles when you're facing these incredibly difficult everyday choices?
The protagonist in the story really wrestles with this. He wants to do the right thing, but he's also trapped in a system that makes it almost impossible to survive without making compromises.
It's heartbreaking because you can really feel his internal struggle, and it makes you think about those times when you've had to make tough choices.
Where your values may be clashed with your circumstances.
It's a universal struggle, and Garcia Ramos doesn't shy away from exploring it in all its complexity. Now, getting back to the concept of equality between men and women, let's talk about one of her most thought-provoking essays.
El verdadero amor es como la estratosfera. No hay arriba ni abajo.
True love is like the stratosphere. There is no up or down. It's such a powerful metaphor for how relationships should be.
Equal, respectful, free from those power dynamics that so often dominate how men and women interact.
Exactly. But she doesn't just paint this idealistic picture. She contrasts it with the reality of how sexism plays out in everyday life. And she doesn't just focus on those overt examples of discrimination.
She digs into those subtle, almost invisible ways that sexism permeates our language, our behaviors, and even our thoughts.
Like in that hypothetical job interview scenario she describes, the same behavior is perceived completely differently depending on whether it's a man or a woman exhibiting it.
It's a brilliant way to illustrate those double standards that women face all the time.
And she also critiques the way language itself can be used to reinforce those power dynamics.
Like the example of how puta is used to degrade women, while puko can actually be a term of endearment for men.
It's such a stark reminder that even our words can reflect and perpetuate these deeply ingrained sexist attitudes.
It makes you think about all those subtle ways that sexism can show up in our everyday interactions, even without us realizing it.
It's a challenge to be more aware of those nuances, both in our own behavior and in the language we use.
And it's not just about being politically correct. It's about understanding how those subtle forms of sexism can contribute to a culture where women are constantly being judged and held to different standards than men.
It's about recognizing that true equality requires a much deeper shift in our attitudes and behaviors.
It's about creating a world where everyone, regardless of gender, can live and love authentically and freely.
Exactly. And that's what makes these essays so powerful. They're not just critiquing the problems, they're also offering us a vision for a more just and equitable future. You know, it's really amazing how these essays, even though they were written a while ago,
Still feels so relevant today.
they really do.
It's like they've tapped into these universal struggles
Definitely. That feeling of holding on to your identity.
in a world that's constantly trying to make everyone the same.
Yeah, that's a big one. And also that whole idea of balancing personal ambition with a sense of belonging.
And then those tough ethical choices we face.
When doing the right thing clashes with what's easy or convenient.
It's like these are questions that resonate with people everywhere, no matter where they come from.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the things that makes these essays so powerful.
They speak to these timeless human experiences.
Exactly. And one of those experiences that Barzi really captures is that feeling of losing touch with your roots.
Like in Año Bisiesto, with that brilliant metaphor of the Cyclops Polyphemus.
Who loses his sight and then his identity.
It's such a powerful image for what happens when we lose touch with the things that make us unique.
It's like we become adrift, you know? We lose our compass.
And Barzi brings it to life with those hilarious anecdotes.
Like Carlo, completely clueless about his Italian heritage.
I know, right? Not even knowing where Italy is on a map.
It's funny, but it also makes you think, how many of us are taking our own heritage for granted?
I think that's a question a lot of people are grappling with these days.
It's like a wake-up call to really examine what shapes our identity.
And how we can preserve those things that make us who we are.
But it's not just about preserving the past, right?
It's about actively engaging with it.
Figuring out what parts we want to carry forward.
Into the future.
Exactly. Finding that balance between tradition and change.
That brings up a whole other challenge. How do you pass that heritage down?
Especially to kids who are growing up in a world that's so different from the one we inherited.
It's like they're swimming in a sea of information and influences.
And it can be hard to filter out the noise.
And that's where Barzi's essay on raising kids really hits home.
La crianza, con la boca es su mami.
It tackles that very issue of instilling values in a world that's full of conflicting messages.
He really captures that struggle that so many parents face,
Trying to do the right thing.
while also being a product of the very system you're criticizing.
It's like that classic saying, do as I say, not as I do.
And of course, the kids see right through it.
Like Tanya calling out her dad for criticizing capitalism while wearing American brands.
It's that moment when you realize you have to walk the walk.
Not just talk the talk.
And then Garcia Remis takes this idea of cultural transmission to a whole other level with her essay on emigration.
Los cerebros que se van y el corazón que se queda.
It captures that feeling of being caught between two worlds.
Yeah, the pull of opportunity versus the longing for home.
She really paints a vivid picture of that tension.
Between those who leave and those who stay behind.
It's like this unspoken dialogue.
Full of longing and resentment, and maybe even a little bit of guilt.
And then there's that whole question of what home really means.
In a world where people are constantly on the move.
Is it a physical place?
Or a set of values.
Or something deeper?
A feeling of belonging, maybe.
It's a question that a lot of people are wrestling with.
Especially in today's globalized world.
And even as we're grappling with these big questions about identity and belonging, Garcia Remis also brings us back to those everyday moral dilemmas.
Like in her essay, Justos, brother, esto está difícil.
With the student who's tempted to use stolen car parts.
It's a powerful reminder that sometimes even the best intentions can clash with harsh realities.
And it makes you question, what would you do in that situation?
Where do you draw the line?
It's not always easy to know the answer.
And then, of course, there's her brilliant analysis of sexism in Greek. El verdadero amor es como la estratosfera. No hay arriba ni abajo.
She uses that amazing metaphor of true love being like the stratosphere, a space without hierarchy.
It's such a beautiful image.
But then she contrasts it with the reality of how sexism plays out in everyday life.
And she doesn't just focus on the big, obvious examples of discrimination.
She digs into those subtle ways that sexism shows up in our language and our behavior.
Like her example of the job interview scenario.
Where the same actions are judged completely differently depending on whether it's a man or a woman.
It's a perfect illustration of those double standards that women face all the time.
And she also talks about how language itself can be used to reinforce those power dynamics.
Like the example of puta and puta.
And how they carry such different weight and meaning.
It's a reminder that the words we use have power.
And we need to be mindful of how we're using them.
Because even seemingly small things can contribute to a larger system of inequality.
It's about being more conscious of the messages we're sending.
Both consciously and unconsciously.
And challenging those ingrained assumptions and biases that we've all inherited from society. It's like Barcy and Garcia Ramos are giving us this toolkit for understanding Puerto Rican society.
And not just Puerto Rican society.
Right.
These issues
are universal.
Exactly. We're talking about identity, culture, social change, all these big things.
And one thing that really stands out for me is this idea of resistance.
Oh, yeah. Pushing back against the things that threaten our values.
Whether it's globalization, consumerism, you name it.
They're both so critical of those forces.
But they don't just leave us feeling hopeless.
No, not at all. They show us that we have a choice.
We can resist. We can create something better.
It's like they're saying, don't just sit there and take it. Fight back.
I love that. They're calling us to action. And they do it by making us confront those uncomfortable truths.
Like in Año Bisiesto, when Barcy talks about cultural apathy.
Yeah, that tendency to just go with the flow, to not even think about what makes us unique.
It's like he's shaking us awake, saying, hey, pay attention, this is important.
And once you start paying attention, you can't unsee it.
Like those subtle forms of sexism that Garcia Ramos talks about.
How they're woven into our language, our behavior, everything.
It's like we're all swimming in this sea of assumptions and biases, and we don't even realize it.
And then there's moral compromises we make.
Like the student in Hostos brother, esto está difícil.
Tempted to use stolen car parts.
It's such a tough situation.
Because on one hand, he needs to fix his car.
But on the other hand, it's stealing.
It makes you think about those gray areas in life.
Where the right thing to do isn't always clear.
And how the systems we live in can sometimes force us into those impossible choices.
But even in the face of those challenges, Barcy and Garcia Ramos remind us that we still have a choice.
We can choose to act with integrity.
To fight for a more just world.
To create something better.
And that's where their work becomes so inspiring.
They're not just pointing out the problems, they're offering us a vision.
For a future where everyone can thrive.
A future where we celebrate our differences.
Where relationships are based on equality and respect.
Where we resist those forces that try to homogenize us.
It's a beautiful vision.
And it all starts with us.
With each of us making the choice to be the change we want to see.
So what are we going to do with these tools that Barcy and Garcia Ramos have given us?
How are we going to use them to make a difference?
That's the question we all need to ask ourselves.
And then we need to act.
Because the world needs our voices.
Our creativity.
Our passion.
Let's create a world that's worthy of the legacy of these incredible writers.
A world that's just equitable and full of joy.
That's a world I want to live in.
Me too. And I think it's a world that's within our reach.
If we all work together.
So let's do it.
Until next time, keep those conversations going and keep diving deep.